Hello, this is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. And today we are piloting a new webinar platform for our organization. I wish to welcome you all. This will be a conversation on the closing of gaps in our Texas public schools. As we look at some of the features here, we know that we'll be able to ask questions. We see a questions tab. So if you have a question at any time, please feel free to click on that tab and we'll see if there are any questions as we go along. If there are others on the line who are wanting to be able to speak, we also have a way to be able to pull you into the conversation. So we're looking forward to this time together. Let's see if I can pull up the presentation. Here we go. Our presentation today is on closing gaps in our Texas public schools. When we talk about the closing of gaps, often we think about how it is that there are various subgroups of students. We know that our system of federal accountability requires us to track student performance for various subgroups. For instance, for our Hispanic students, for our African American students, for white students, for Native American students, for Asian and Pacific Islanders, and also according to various categories like economically disadvantaged students, English language learners, etc. So here we see on this opening slide an image of what it looks like for us to be thinking about the performance of various student groups. Here at MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association, our mission is to focus on the closing of gaps in our Texas public schools, or now that we are going national, in our nation's public schools. Here in Texas, the largest subgroup of students are our Latino students, and also English language learners are expected to be 20% of our student population by 2020. So if we were to focus on those two subgroups of students, imagine the impact that all of us could make together here in Texas. So MASBA's mission has been to close gaps for all students, but with a particular focus on the Latino students and the English language learners of our Texas public schools. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see an image of our advocacy agenda for 2018-2019. The first item on our advocacy agenda has been the closing of gaps. It states that MASBA advocates for programs and practices that more quickly close the achievement gap for all Texas students, especially for the Hispanic or Latinx students and English language learners in our Texas public schools. And we stand against all programs and practices that perpetuate and or widen gaps in student performance. Here in the state of Texas, our state accountability system has an indicator for the closing of gaps. I cite here the data from my own school district here in the Austin ISD. You can see that we have 130 schools. All of the information for your districts here in Texas can be found at txschools.gov. You can see how it is on this, that they have an A through F grade for the closing of gaps for every district in the state of Texas. Also for every school in the state of Texas is rated on the closing of gaps. We see on the right-hand side how it is that various scores are calculated. If we were to scroll down on that same page, we see the scores for various student groups, and we can begin to see how it is that various groups are doing with respect to the closing of gaps. You can see here, for instance, that when it comes to math, we're here in the Austin ISD, we're closing gaps for African American, Asian, Hispanic, and white students, but then you can see Pacific Islanders, we got a red X there. So if you pull up that data for your own districts, it'll give you a sense of how it is that your district is doing with respect to the closing of gaps. txschools.gov also shares closing gaps data for graduation and for post-secondary readiness. So any of us can log into that website and see how it is that our districts are doing with respect to preparing our students for graduating students and preparing them for life beyond high school. Let's simply start with a few definitions. When we're talking about the closing of gaps, what are we referring to? Typically, there are three different types of gaps that we're speaking about in education. We speak about opportunity gaps, we speak about achievement gaps, and we speak about learning gaps. Let's take them in order. Generally speaking, opportunity gaps refer to the inputs, the unequal or inequitable distribution of resources and opportunities. Let's unpack that first before we get to achievement gaps. So opportunity gaps are the inputs, so that, for instance, some of them could be the lack of financial resources of our students and their families, prejudices and biases that could keep them from performing at the same levels as other students, the education and language proficiency of their parents. That will be something that influences their education and their outcomes. Their teachers, I put here less effective teaching in challenged schools. Inadequate resources and opportunities, which is why I like the image included at the top of this slide. You'll notice for opportunity gaps in the website that we took this image from, it shows a test prep manual. Not all students have the resources to be able to purchase test prep materials. So those who have those resources will be at an advantage when it comes to test prep and to heightened test scores. And so we just want to be aware of the opportunity gaps that resources cause. And finally, lack of learning technologies. Many of our districts are focused on such things as internet access for our students. Why would we do that? Because we believe that that is an output that will have an impact on such things as their learning and their scores. When we think of opportunity gaps, then we think of outputs. The first output that we think of is the role of parents. In this presentation today, we're going to be relying on several images. If indeed it's true that a picture is worth 1,000 words, then this presentation is a 32,000 word presentation. We have several images that deal with gaps in this presentation. Let's begin with this image of the important role of parents in the education of their students. Here we see an image of two parents lifting up their child, helping their child to achieve education. Let's simply pause for a moment and consider that there are many families in which there are not two parents helping to raise up their children to the heights of education. There are various parents who experience challenges, various children who are being raised in home environments where they don't have that same type of lifting up. I'm thinking, for instance, of a recent visit I had to a local attorney's office here in Austin, an immigration attorney, where there was a young lady, a young mother who was in the office who had a very young child, and there was no verbal interaction going on between that mother and her child. And so all of us know how important it is for students to grow up in environments that are rich in vocabulary. And in the case of this mother and her child, certainly that was not happening. But we see in this image then two parents helping to raise their child up to the heights of education with other heights still to come. That child's future career, he or she is going to need help achieving his or her career. And then in the future, establishing his or her own family. As we can see suggested in this image, this child is going to be needing a lot of help in the future. Before I go on to the next slide, I just want to pull our attention again to various features on this new platform, including questions. If you have anything that you'd like to share, happy for you to add your comments there. We're also able to share. So if anyone would like to be recognized, happy to pull your voice into this conversation as well. Going on to the next slide then, we see an image of the important role of parents in schools. So when schools are not performing as we'd like, there are various things that we look at as factors for why it is that those schools are not performing. You can see that the greatest scrutiny often goes toward our teachers. There's also scrutiny here in this image for principals, those who are responsible for the education in our schools. But you'll notice that this three-legged stool is missing a leg. And which leg is missing in this instance? Parents. Can a three-legged stool stand without that third leg? It can. The role of parents is essential in lifting up our schools. So when schools aren't performing, one of the challenges that we have is figuring out how it is we can address that third leg, how it is that we can help our parents, because we know that they are the primary educators of our students. We also want to acknowledge some of the obstacles that are faced by our students and their families. If education were to be likened to a race or the gaining of a career or whatever it is in life, we can see how it is that some persons have to overcome more obstacles than other persons. Here we see the young lady on the left has various obstacles to face, beginning with the fact that she has a ball and chain around her ankle. You can see some landmines in front of her, some barbed wire, a crocodile, other obstacles, including a pit with various spears coming out of it. It's going to be difficult for her to reach the finish line. And the gentleman on the left who's saying, "What's the matter? It's the same distance." Well, perhaps it's the same distance, but obviously he has less obstacles, less hurdles that he needs to cross on his way to that finish line. Imagine for a moment that that finish line is the graduation of our students. Some students are going to more easily reach the finish line. Other students are going to be more challenged, are going to need more help, more assistance. So we begin by acknowledging the many obstacles that are faced by our students and their families. That should lead to a reflection for us as superintendents and trustees and interested community members on how it is that we can help to take away some of those obstacles and or how it is that we can help to facilitate their reaching the finish line. In this image, we see the artist has depicted the USS inequality. When we're talking about how it is that it's more easy for some to reach the finish line than for others, notice the place of poor kids on the USS inequality. Notice the place of middle-class kids. What about the rich? The ship is sinking, the ship is sinking. I think that this is an important image for us to reflect on as superintendents, as trustees, as those interested in public education, simply because if we do not educate the most challenged students in our society, then that endangers our entire society. We can't think that we can sit comfortably on the deck if there are students who are not being well served. When we reflect on income inequality, this image simply helps to draw our attention to the fact of how it is that there are various, that the resources enjoyed by persons in our community is not very well balanced. You can see, I'm not an engineer, but I can look at this picture and recognize that what we're seeing here is physically impossible. If that 1% weighs as much as the 99%, within MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association, certainly one of our foci is how it is that we can best help those students with a lack of educational resources so that that lack of educational resources doesn't inhibit them, doesn't keep them from achieving their future goals. You may have seen this cartoon before. This is an image of a child coming to school with a lot of baggage. You can see that he's homeless and hungry and ill. Imagine for a moment being in that child's shoes, being homeless and or hungry and or ill, and then having to concentrate on learning in school. This child in this cartoon is bringing a lot of baggage to school, asking, could someone help me with these? I'm late for math class. Imagine having to focus on math when you're thinking, when you're distracted by issues like that. For that reason, here in the Austin ISD, we have a big focus on social emotional learning, how it is that we can help students to process what's going on in their lives outside of school, so that when they're in school, we might be most effectively and efficiently using that time to be assisting them with learning. Also, imagine for a moment the challenges that our teachers face. So not only are they with those students who are homeless and or hungry and or ill, but in this image we see a number of challenges that might be faced by the teachers in our classrooms. I often share the story. I tutor 6th grade math for 45 minutes a week, and those 45 minutes a week are sobering to see some of the challenges faced by our teachers. Here in this image, we can see what's in front of the teacher, a test schedule. We see a box that she can put coins into to buy her own school supplies, all the paperwork on her desk that she needs to do. But then when we look at the students' desks, we start to get an idea of some of the challenges faced by some of our teachers, of having to deal with students who are hungry, who are teen parents, who are homeless, who are without parents themselves, who find themselves on television and or video games for several hours a day, who lack discipline, who don't have the necessary materials like books to be able to study, who are facing a substance addiction, who may be overcoming abuse. So our teachers are under the gun in many ways, working with students who come from very challenged home environments. And they're also under a lot of scrutiny. As we can see here, all the focus on the teacher, all the cameras, all the persons who are asking the teacher, what are you doing wrong? As if it's that teacher's fault when he or she is trying his or her best to deal with the various challenges in his or her classroom. Again, I see this every week as I tutor math, 6th grade math. The example I would share this last week of a young man, a 6th grader, who struggled to read. And when we were trying to go through a problem, he said, can you read it to me? Right? Here's a young man who is struggling to read. The question for us becomes, how do we help these students to acquire the knowledge and the skills that they need to be successful? So the opportunity gaps refer to the outputs. When we talk about the gaps in opportunity, it's the gaps in the outputs, the resources. But when we talk about the achievement gap, the opportunity gap refers to the inputs, my apologies. The opportunity gap refers to the inputs. The achievement gap refers to the outputs, the inequitable or unequal distribution of education results and benefits. Just want to pause there to apologize for confusing that in my mind earlier. I think I was telling you that opportunity gap refers to output. So opportunity gap refers to inputs, the inputs in the educational system. The achievement gap refers to the outputs. Some of those disparities are going to manifest themselves as a result of sex. That is, that boys or girls are going to outperform one another. Here in the Austin ISD, for instance, I remember when I came on the board 7 years ago, the superintendent at that time said, we have a boy problem in the Austin ISD. At that time, girls were outperforming boys on all academic and disciplinary indicators. So that could be one example of a disparity. It could be by sex, it could be by income, where students with resources are outperforming students with less resources. We often refer to them as our socioeconomically disadvantaged students or our eco-dis students. It could be gaps as a result of race, so that, for instance, when we look at the performance of white students, of Latino students, of African American students, of Asian students, We might see how it is that various groups perform at different levels. And finally, language is important. We said that here at MASBA, we have a particular interest in our Latinx students, but also in our English language learners, many of whom are Spanish speaking, who speak Spanish at home. Those who speak Spanish at home, whose parents speak less English, may have some challenges as a result in achieving the same outcomes educationally. Achievement gaps can manifest themselves in many ways. Some of the indicators that we use in the world of education might include grades, how it is that some students are going to achieve higher grades than others. Standardized test scores, some students are going to have higher standardized test scores than others. Graduation rates, some student subgroups are going to have higher graduation rates. Post-secondary readiness, some are going to be more prepared for college, career, military, and life. Course completion, I think in a particular way of advanced placement courses, and courses where students are receiving higher levels of instruction, how it is that often may break down according to various categories of sex, income, race, or language. Discipline, here for a long time in the Austin ISD, we've had a challenge of African American and Latinx students being disciplined at higher rates than other subgroups. Certainly something for us as superintendents and trustees to think through in our policy and in the administration of our school districts. And finally, absenteeism. At least here in the Austin ISD, we've often had a challenge with higher with higher absences by students in certain subgroups. For instance, our economically disadvantaged students here in the Austin ISD often have a much higher rate of absenteeism. We reflect on the gaps in this image. Oops, let's go back to that. We see various graduates coming through the doors. The caption says, many more women than men graduate. So there we see one gap. More women are graduating than men, more girls than boys. Again, the boy problem that I referred to. But it says far fewer women achieve STEM degrees. So as you can see, for those who are coming out of the door with degrees in STEM related fields, we see 2 guys and 1 gal. So certainly, even though women are graduating at higher rates, fewer of them are achieving STEM degrees. Some of the disparities that we see then here are certainly more people coming out of the non-STEM door, more women coming out of the non-STEM door, more guys coming out of the STEM door. Various disparities are evident in this image. The achievement gap. It's more difficult for some students to achieve greater heights than others. Think of the challenges for these students to achieve graduation, for instance. Do you notice the square wheel in this image? How difficult would that be to get that heavy object all the way up the hill? Some of our students are more challenged than others when it comes to completing school, when it comes to graduating, when it comes to being prepared for their future studies and careers and the opportunities that life has for them. What are some of the obstacles? This image makes clear that one of the big obstacles for our students is poverty. Our economically disadvantaged students often come into our classrooms unable to learn in the same way because of the obstacles that they face. You can see here the young people in the back who are being blocked from seeing the whiteboard by a large figure labeled poverty. I'm thinking before I tutored 6th grade math, last year I was tutoring 8th grade math, and I'll never forget an 8th grader, I've known him for a long, long time, Jesus. And Jesus was tutoring him, and the question I had for him was, what is 2 times 3? And Jesus, now being in the 8th grade, could not tell me what 2 times 3 is. So figuring out, that's it was tough for me to see, especially having known Jesus and his family for years, that he couldn't tell me what 2 times 3 was. A lot of that results from various factors, obviously, in his life and the life of his family, and many of those stemming from challenges, for instance, from the fact that Jesus and his family, they face several challenges. And so one of the challenges we have is, how do we raise up students like Jesus? How do we help to raise them up to be at the same levels as other students? This image begins to capture a bit of that challenge. How do we raise them up? A lot of it comes down to that knowledge. How do we help students like Jesus with that knowledge of what 2 times 3 is, or even better, how to figure that out so that they can be raising themselves up? Johns Hopkins School of Education has said that achievement gaps remain a thorn in the side of American democratic education. I'm imagining that all of us as superintendents and trustees think deeply on the gaps that exist in our own districts. All of us have gaps, which is why I so respect MASBA's mission of focusing on those gaps. All of us have gaps in our district. They are a thorn in our side. We all want to find ways to overcome them. How do we start finding those ways and helping one another to close those gaps in our districts? So we've talked about opportunity gaps, the inputs. We've talked about achievement gaps, the outputs. Now we'll talk about the learning gaps. What is a learning gap? A learning gap refers to the relative performance of individual students, IDES, that is, the disparity between what a student has actually learned and what a student is expected to learn at a particular age or grade level. So if we go back to the example of Jesus, obviously Jesus had a learning gap. He didn't learn at the appropriate grade or age level what 2 times 3 was, and as a result, he found himself now in the 8th grade, not knowing how to figure that out. Learning gaps then are disparities between what students learn and what students are expected to learn. And the challenge with learning gaps is that they compound over time. In teaching, we talk about scaffolding. How it is that we build on previous knowledge, so that, for instance, I need to be able to know what 2 times 3 is before I can start doing more complex operations like 20 times 30 or 220 times 330, right? We scaffold over time. So if we don't learn one skill, if we're absent that day, or if for whatever reason we don't understand a concept, then it becomes more and more difficult because those concepts build on one another. Look at this image carefully and see if you can, how many learning gaps you can see in this image of a graduate now. Looks like he is ready to cross the stage, texting a friend saying, "You're not gonna believe this, but I am about to graduate. I am so ready for collage." We know what he was trying to communicate, but we can also see the gaps that may have occurred in his learning. How do we then equip students with the necessary knowledge and skills for them to be able to recognize themselves, the various gaps that might have taken place in their own learning? Here's an image from our MASBA brochure that we created nearly 2 years ago now. With respect to our messaging, in Spanish we say vámonos, let's go. Here at MASBA we say más vámonos, let's MASBA, let's focus ourselves on closing the opportunity and achievement gaps that exist in our districts. Here we see an image. Since I represent the Austin ISD, I simply took this image of the closing of gaps from our own district literature, because that's essentially what MASBA needs to be about, how it is that we are closing gaps for all students, how it is that we take a look at the highest achieving student groups, the yellow line in this case, and how it is that we can help all students to be achieving at that level. Imagine for a moment what this world would be like if we got all students achieving at the same levels. As you can see on the bottom left there, according to Dr. Michael Klein of the Hobby Center at Rice University, if we were able to close the achievement gap here in Texas by 2050, we would add $899 billion per year to our Texas economy. Let's pause and reflect on that for just a moment. If we were able to take all of those student groups and lift them up to the same level as that yellow student group, the line that represents that student group, if we were able to get all students up and we were able to close those gaps by 2050, we would be adding 899 billion with a B to our Texas economy every single year. It's for that reason that we here at MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association, take so seriously the closing of gaps. Not only will it be lifting up these students and their families, it'll also be making a tremendous impact on our society and on our economy. We get to some of the challenges in closing gaps. One of the challenges is that gaps manifest themselves early in life. So students beginning at young children beginning at 2 or 3 years old are already manifesting gaps. I go back to the example of the child in the lawyer's office before, where her mother was not interacting with her, right? She's going to be at a disadvantage compared to a child who had interactions with a parent or with parents with a rich vocabulary. So gaps manifest themselves early in life, they grow over time, and as they continue to grow, that poses serious consequences for that child's overall achievement and long-term prosperity. Another challenge includes the fact that achievement gaps by race and by income correlate with opportunity gaps. Opportunity gaps, such factors as their developmental environment, their home learning conditions, school factors, student mobility. We haven't talked about that, but here in the Austin ISD, the year before last, I remember our mobility rate at that time was some 37%. But 37% of our students during the course of a school year moved schools. It was just mind-blowing to think that over a third of our students during any given school year were moving from one school to another. So it's factors like that that impact the education of our students. Here we see an image of some of the challenges when we talk about the gaps widening over time. Here's an image of a relay race with hurdles. I'm not so clued into the world of sports, but we see various hurdles here. How it is that one child is running a race with no hurdles, another child has various hurdles that he or she will need to overcome. For instance, the fact that he or she has heard 30 million fewer words by the time that he or she is in pre-K. Yikes. Thinking back to that young girl, the infant girl in the attorney's office with her mother who was not speaking with her for the many minutes that we were waiting there. For a child to enter school having heard 30 million fewer words than his or her peer, obviously is going to put him or her at disadvantage. We see how it is that those hurdles continue over time. In kindergarten, being able to demonstrate academic readiness. By the 4th grade, having a lower reading test score or lower math scores or lower scores in any subject area. And then 8th grade, those gaps are just going to keep widening till high school, and that makes them less likely to graduate, less likely to enter college. And so these are all factors that we really need to be taking seriously as superintendents and trustees and interested community members. Perhaps we've all seen this video on YouTube, and I apologize that it seems that the line is cut off at the bottom, unless you're seeing it better than I. But on YouTube, if you put the search term inequality race or inequity race or opportunity race, you'll see a video that describes a race of persons of various races, various colors, who are racing against one another. And you can see how it is that some of them are facing, for instance, discrimination once they even begin to run. In this video, those students of color don't even begin running until the civil rights era, till 1964. So all of the white students in the video are running for generations and handing off increasing wealth to their kids. And then finally, when the students of color do begin to run in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, you can see some of the challenges that they begin to face in running the race. Challenges like discrimination, poor schooling, which is not faced by the students in the other lanes, underemployment, standardized tests. All students need to jump the shark pool of standardized tests, but certainly for the young man, you can see that he struggled to jump, to cross that hurdle. The school to prison pipeline, we see the young man being carried away with some of his peers off to prison, racial profiling, and then an image toward the end, whereas the young lady of color meets a brick wall that says dead end, we see a young white man being carried along the conveyor belt of privilege, so he's not even running the race, he's just being carried along and crossing the finish line. I'm sure many of us have seen that video before. It's certainly sobering, certainly should cause us to stop and to reflect on our own privilege and the lack of privilege of so many students and families that we serve. In the end of that video, we see the image of a bulldozer coming, ready to tear down that wall. And I think the question for all of us as superintendents, trustees, community members might rightly be, what are we doing to help tear down the walls that are serving as obstacles to the success of our students? We need to be about the business of tearing down walls. Decades later, so some of the challenges that our focus on achievement, on gaps, opportunity achievement gaps started decades ago, and now decades later, 2019, 2020, these gaps continue to persist. So many factors are associated with those gaps, and the challenge that we have is that the research on causes is so inconclusive. There are so many factors that go into the success of our students that it becomes difficult to isolate the factors that are at work here. One thing that I do point out, according to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in a poll of teachers, 12% of teachers believed that their students were entering their classrooms prepared for on-grade level work. So stop and think about that for a moment. That means that 88% of students, 88% of students, according to their teachers, were perceived to be entering their classrooms not at grade level. 88% creates a challenge for us to get those students caught up. Another challenge that we have is what we refer to as the summer slide. Our students are learning during the school year, but then when they go away from school, what are they learning when they're not at school? When we take a week off for Thanksgiving, or 2 weeks off for the holidays at the end of the year, right? What are our students doing during that time away from school? Are they using it to learn and to grow in some way? It's typically the case that more privileged students, have parents who are more focused on their learning activities, whereas students from other backgrounds often don't have that, where a week of Thanksgiving break or 2 weeks of holiday break or a summer break becomes a time of television and video games and other activities where their peers are outracing them. Go back to the image of the race, where their peers are passing them up because they're more focused on learning. US kids not so good at math. This image depicts our US education system, particularly in an age of resegregation. We see this here in the Austin ISD. Back in the 80s, we had an attempt to desegregate the school. Now what we see is students are largely going to schools based on where they live. So there's been this resegregation of our public schools here in Austin. The math on the board says one white kid in a well-funded white school plus one black kid in an underfunded ghetto school equals how many well-educated children equipped for the future? One. Here at MASBA, our focus is on that second one in that equation, in students of color who are in more challenging environments. We want to, at the end of the day, we want this equation to read 1 + 1 = 2. How do we help to equip all of our students for future success? Factors that help close gaps. According to a bit of my research, some of the factors that might help to close gaps in our districts include teacher effectiveness, making sure that we're putting quality teachers with our students. Another factor might be smaller class sizes. Certainly, I taught high school for 2 years. The largest class I ever taught was 19 students. When I hear of teachers who are teaching 20, 25, 30 students, boy, my heart goes out to them. I know the challenges that they're facing. Smaller class sizes could certainly help to close gaps. Increasing academic rigor. I remember at the time that I was teaching, I would drive by one school to get to the school where I was teaching, and those students would go in every day without the same backpacks and books and resources. And it made me think that, without that homework, without that rigor, that these students were not going to be as well prepared as the students that I was teaching. Finally, early childhood programs can help to close gaps. Why early childhood? Because the money that we invest at that level has a higher return. We often say for every dollar that we invest in early childhood programs, the return is going to be at least $6 or $7 on that dollar, simply because we're helping to close gaps at those early ages. So certainly we want to encourage investments in early education. Former US Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings once said, "A teacher who knows what he or she is doing, knows his or her subject matter, and knows how to impart knowledge to kids is a critical piece of closing the achievement gap." Interesting. So Secretary Spellings was pointing to the importance of teachers, which is what we were doing when we talked about teacher effectiveness and smaller class sizes. The challenge being that we often put a lot of scrutiny onto teachers when they influence so little of our children's lives. As Randy Weingarten of the American Federation of Teachers says, 2/3 of the academic gap comes from factors outside of school. So 1/3 of the factors then of the achievement gap come from inside the school, but 2/3 of those factors come from outside the school. She says teachers influence about 7 to 10% of what happens in kids' lives. 7 to 10% of what happens in a kid's life is influenced by a teacher, which means that 90 to 93% of what happens in a child's life is happening outside of school. Weingarten continues, when you think about those statistics, you have to think about how to re-envision education so it's holistic and so we share responsibility. Remember that three-legged stool? Suddenly, we start thinking about how it is that without that third leg, the education of our children is at risk. So, for instance, how can we start to empower parents to be helping their children with words? Here's a graph of the cumulative vocabulary of 3-year-old children, how it is that a child from a professional family has a much larger vocabulary than a disadvantaged child. A lot of that, again, that's before they come to their teachers. There's already a gap. How can we help parents to be the primary teachers of their students? How can we help the parents of disadvantaged children to help their children with an increased vocabulary so that that gap is not present when they step into our classrooms? Again, that third leg of the stool is important. And what happens is, instead of looking at factors, even though teachers are influencing 7 to 10% of our children's educational outcomes, what happens? We too often blame our teachers. There are other factors at work. In this image, we see how it is that poverty and racism, for instance, are creating these gaps. And yet, whom are we blaming? Too often, we're blaming the teachers. Diane Ravitch says, in DC, policymakers think that if we can only have high enough standards, tough enough tests, and hold people accountable, we can close the achievement gap. Pause and think about that for a moment. In order to close the achievement gap, we just need higher standards, tougher tests, hold our teachers accountable. Diane Ravitch says that hasn't happened. In fact, the Every Student Succeeds Act is based on the same test-based and market-driven framework and ideology. What I'd like to do in the minutes that we have left is simply to challenge us to rethink how we think about gaps, because too often gaps are the result of standardized test scores. It's a result of this culture of testing in which we find ourselves. Here we see an image of a teacher who, as a result of No Child Left Behind and the testing culture that act seeks to create, the child is asking, is this the test to test us for the test, to see if we're ready for the test? We just see that how it is that we have this renewed focus on testing and teaching the test like we've never seen before. And so often the indicators that we have for closing gaps is based on standardized testing. This image I've been using for years now of a student with a teacher and administrator and a state official looking over his shoulder as he's participating in high stakes testing. You can see what he's written on his paper, SOL. I'm sure that's an acronym for something. But the teacher is sweating behind him saying, David, it's problem 9, you know it, relax, relax. And the administrator is all nervous and upset too, saying, no pressure, but if he misses it, you're out of a teaching job. And then we see the state official behind the administrator saying, no problem if you miss problem 9, we'll pull your accreditation and you'll bring shame on your community. Here in Texas, we already have that shaming going on in the grades that we're assigning to individual schools. And on the wall, we all see that it says the joy of learning. Where's the joy of learning in that picture? President George W. Bush, No Child Left Behind, and there we see Secretary Margaret Spellings, who talked about the importance of teachers and all of this. How interesting that when we create this testing culture, what happens? Those who create the tests create them in such a way, and we saw this here in the Austin ISD in these 7 years that I've been on the board, various years in which the test is designed to show how it is that as you continue to raise the standards in testing, how it is that less and less students achieve, and it sets up this rhetoric of how it is that our public schools are failing. It's an abomination. And then we start blaming the teachers, right? Which is absolutely counterproductive because they're on the front line. They are working with the students every single day, doing the best that they can with what they have to assist our students and their families, and yet we put them in the crosshairs. We put them, they're the first ones that we seek to execute. Maybe we should be placing the blame in other places. At least here in Texas, this last legislative session brought attention to the fact of how it was that education resources had been diverted, monies had been diverted away from education. We did a study of the percent of that the state was paying in various school districts, and it was so low in many cases. I'm thinking here in the Austin ISD, the state's share of education, if I'm remembering correctly, was like 4%. And so as a result of HB3, the goal is to get the state paying up to 50% of the education in our Texas public schools. But here we see a cutting of education resources on the one hand, on the left, while on the right, there's a lifting of education standards, right? It would be one thing if education standards were lifted and more resources were given, right? Let's pay these teachers what they're worth and get them the resources and the personnel to be able to assist them to get our students crossing that bar. But if we're cutting resources and lifting standards, then that creates an untenable situation. And so why would we do this as a society? And we're starting to wrap up now. But why would we do this? It just seems that there's this push toward the privatization of our public schools. If we could just call it what it is. Here in Texas and in many places throughout the nation, there is a privatization of public education where people look at our students as profit potential. Here in this cartoon, we see a businessman saying, many of us in business support the privatization of public education because when we look at the youth of America, we see, and then we see the dollar sign on the student's head, a lot of potential that public schools have failed to develop. No, there is so much money in education. There's so many people looking to profit from education. Here in Austin, we can think of a few examples. One of the reasons that we so opposed charter schools here in Austin, at the time when I joined the board, there was a school that was given over to a performing neighborhood school here in the Austin ISD that was given over to a charter school with the thought that they would develop the entire vertical team into their charter school. It was their way of saying, if you just give us one vertical team, then we'll be happy with that and we won't be your competitor in any other way. Their CEO was making at that time more than 4 times what our superintendent was making to lead a much smaller school system. I think at that time his school system was not even a third of the Austin ISD, and he was making 4 times more. Many of us saw more recent news when children were being incarcerated along the US-Mexico border. The CEO of that school system that was doing that was making at that time, I'm guessing, some $1.4 million a year. There's a lot of money to be made in education. A lot of people are profiting from that, which is why we see this move in government toward the privatization of public education, because a lot of those who are supporting the campaigns of those who are currently in office are getting them to dance to that music. So let's rethink gaps. Anya Kamenetz, who writes for the Business Insider, says, we accept the idea of an achievement gap. It's not in any way an achievement gap, it's an advantage gap. The idea that these scores are applied to children as though they define the children instead of defining the children's circumstances is something that recurs again and again and is not helpful. Think about that for a moment. These standardized tests are not indicators of what our students know. They're indicators of our students' circumstances. Which is why, as this image shows, achievement gaps, why do we call them achievement gaps? They're really poverty gaps. They're advantage gaps, as Anya says. George Kuru says, he essentially invites us to reflect on our focus. In education, how often does data-driven mean we become weakness-focused, right? We start using standardized testing to show the gaps that exist, knowing that those standardized tests are going to be focused on weaknesses, on deficits, rather than on the real gifts of our students. Katie Pearson says, the achievement gap does not represent a gap in the cognitive abilities of students of color. It represents a gap in the undiscovered and untapped potential of these students who have received limited access to the same content through the cultural barriers that get in the way of cognition. Think about that for a moment. Reflect back on that, the opportunity race, that video of students who were challenged, right? It had nothing to do with those students. They had the same potential as any other student running that race, but they had more limited access, and they had various barriers that they, in the instance of that video, could not overcome. We are used to seeing an image of 3 children attending a ball game, and that's how we think about equity, 3 different children of 3 different heights attending a ball game and not being able to see it. Think about this image here of equity being about this child being able to have access to the same resources, right? In the first image, even though there's equality, even though they're both standing on the same object, she's still not able to reach and enjoy the same resources as the other child. In the second image where there's equity, she is able to enjoy the same resources that he is. Imagine for a moment if we as trustees, as superintendents, as community members were to commit ourselves to equity in our Texas public schools, allowing students to have access to the resources that all other students have access to. Julie Andrews says, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. Think about that for a moment. Julie Andrews, everyone is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, or if you judge a child by his or her ability to complete standardized testing, that child will live his or her whole life believing that he or she is stupid. We've all seen the cartoon before of the gentleman speaking to various animals, to a bird, a monkey, a penguin, an elephant, a goldfish, a sea lion, a dog. For fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam, the same standardized test. Please climb that tree. Yikes. Of course, the monkey's going to be able to climb the tree. What about the fish, the elephant, the penguin, right? That's how the students are in our public schools. They all have different gifts. Why do we need to make them all the same animal, thinking that they should all be able to do a standardized test in the same way? We need to rethink gaps. I conclude first with the words of Gandhi. Gandhi says, there is no school equal to a decent home and no teacher equal to a virtuous parent. I think as superintendents and trustees, if we're going to be serious about closing gaps, it's going to start and it's going to take place outside our public schools. Our teachers are responsible for 7 to 10% of our children's education. That's 90 to 93% that's happening at their homes and outside of our schools. Gandhi is pointing us to the fact that if our students are going to enjoy these opportunities, then we've got to find ways to focus, for instance, on decent homes and virtuous parents, that is, on the lives of our students outside our schools. And I've paraphrased another voice. What I like to say is, if you keep testing a child, and if the child keeps failing your test, it's not the child who is a slow learner. Think about that for a moment, because it just seems that we as a society, we're the slow learners. We keep using standardized tests, high stakes testing to assess our students and to show how it is that gaps aren't closing. Maybe we've got to rethink that in another way. I just want to pause and thank you. We've been talking for an hour together. This is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. I want to pause and thank you for joining us for our first ever webinar as an organization on the closing of gaps in our Texas public schools. I apologize that we couldn't explore in more depth the closing of gaps, but I hope that certainly this time together has helped us to think more deeply on the closing of gaps, especially since the closing of gaps in so many places is tied to the scores of our students, to high stakes testing and standardized tests. Maybe it's time for us to take the lead in helping our society to re-envision a different way rather than playing into this narrative that helps to fuel the privatization of our public schools. Let's see how it is that we might work together to recognize the genius of all our students, the gifts of all our students, the potential of all our students, rather than being the slow learners that we continue to be with respect to standardized tests and high stakes testing. Appreciate you all for tuning in. Have a great day.